3 weeks ago, the Fat Controller had decided to reopen the old Kirkronan branch line. It had been abandoned during the Great Depression, and had fallen into such disrepair that most of it would have to be rebuilt. James had been assigned to help the workmen, and took several supply trains up to Kelsthorpe Road daily. With the Red Engine's help, the work progressed quickly. Before long, the branch line yard at Kelsthorpe Road had been completed, and the workmen began moving down the branch line. One afternoon, James was heading into the Kelsthorpe Road yards with a supply train from Barrow-in-Furness. He was expecting the points to be set for the branch line, but he didn't realise that the workmen had been testing the points into the shed. James gasped as he jerked sharply to the left. As he careened across the turntable, his crew threw on the brakes and jumped clear, but it was too late. Unable to stop in time, James burst through the back of the shed and bounced up the hill behind him. James's driver and fireman quickly ran up to where the Red Engine had stopped with his buffers in a bush. "Are you all right, James?" asked his driver. James didn't reply for a moment. "No," he replied. "I don't think I am." That evening, the Fat Controller came to see the engines in the shed. None of them were looking happy. Evening engines. No doubt you'll have heard about James's accident by now. "We have, sir," Henry replied. "How long will James be at the works?" "Several weeks, I'm afraid. He was damaged quite badly in the accident." Silence fell over the shed for a few moments. "But, sir, what about that Kirkronan line?" Diesel asked. The Fat Controller thought for a moment. James had been the only engine available to help with the reconstruction. "I'll have to see about borrowing another engine from the other railway," the Fat Controller said. A moment later, Alice spoke up.
"I'd be happy to take the supplies to Kelsthorpe Road, sir."
The Fat Controller considered Alice's offer for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Alice. I believe you'll have time to take 2 per day?"
"That's right, sir."
With that, the Fat Controller got into his car and left. Although he had gone with Alice's idea, he did have his reservations. Alice was too heavy to go down the reconstructed branch line, and having the workmen take the supplies down from the mainline junction would be inefficient. He would just have to see how it went. One morning, a couple of weeks after James's accident, Oliver was taking on coal at Tidmouth when Alice arrived. She needed to wait for Donald, who was bringing some ballast down from the Aylesdale Railway. Oliver glanced over as Alice stopped next to him. "Morning, Alice."
"Hello, Oliver. How have you been?"
"Quite well. How's the construction going?"
"It's slowed down a bit now they have to haul supplies from Kelsthorpe Road. I don't think the Fat Controller's too happy about that."
"It seems he may have to borrow another engine from the other railway, after all." Alice frowned, slightly worried.
"Is there somewhere else he can find an engine?"
"Well, Alfred usually helps out, but I'm not sure if the Bluebell Railway could spare him for as long as we need. Why do you ask?"
"When I was running heritage trains in London, I befriended a few of the diesels up there. It seems quite a few of them were being withdrawn."
A worried look crossed Oliver's face. "By withdrawn, do you mean—"
"Scrapped, yes. It seems the other railway was trying to cut costs by reducing their fleet to just what they need, getting rid of experimental and non-standard designs, mostly. I think it was some sort of national traction plan."
"I see." Oliver glanced over curiously. "What did they say was standard?"
"Diesel electrics, mostly."
"Oh," Oliver said quietly, as Alice's words sunk in. Even though the diesels had replaced him and the other steam engines, Oliver couldn't help feeling a little sad. They were engines, after all. Then he remembered. When he'd been running from the scrapper's torch, Oliver had hidden on a disused quarry branch to avoid being spotted by the diesels. As he'd been leaving, an unscheduled freight extra had come through. D7101, who had been taking the train, had been impressed by Oliver's courage and hadn't reported him to the other railway's controllers. That diesel had been a Class 35, Oliver recalled, one of the Western region's unique diesel hydraulic locomotives. As he puffed off to take his train, Oliver couldn't help wondering what had happened to him. "Is it just me, or does Oliver seem a wee bit upset?" Donald asked after he'd pulled up next to Alice.
I think he is.
Alice replied. Later that night, Oliver returned to the sheds at Alsborough. "You look a wee bit upset, Oliver," Donald said. "What's got you doing?" "There was the diesel on the other railway, who looked the other way while I was escaping. I've just learnt that his class was withdrawn, years ago." "You know, just because an engine's been withdrawn doesn't mean they've been scrapped," Duck said. The other 3 engines looked at Duck. "Someone has to help look after the line. I mean, look at Frank on the Arlesdale Railway, and Diesel here. They hardly ever pull a train that isn't for some sort of maintenance." Oliver smiled weakly. He knew Duck was trying to cheer him up. But as Oliver headed down the line the next day, he couldn't help thinking about what Duck had said. As he arrived at Knapford, he spotted the Fat Controller on the platform. "Excuse me, sir." The Fat Controller turned around. "Hello, Oliver." "Sir, I've heard you're planning to bring in another engine to help with the Kirk-Ronan line." "I'm considering it, yes." "I know one who would fit in well here, sir. A diesel from the other railway." The Fat Controller was intrigued. "Which engine would this be?" "D7101, sir. We crossed paths when I was escaping, and he looked the other way." 7101. That would be a Class 35. As I recall, they were withdrawn about 9 years ago." "Yes, sir, but I thought he might have been put on maintenance trains, or preserved." The Fat Controller nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Oliver. I'll see what I can find out." "Thank you, sir," Oliver replied. Later that day, around afternoon tea time, Diesel was shunting in the yard when the yardmaster came up. "Diesel, you'll need to put together another train of supplies for the Kirk-Ronan reconstruction," he said. Diesel frowned, confused. "Another one? But Alice has already taken both of them up for today." "Controller's orders, Diesel. It'll need to depart in about half an hour or so." "I'll sort it out," Diesel replied. About half an hour later, Diesel had just finished getting the train ready. He spotted the Fat Controller standing next to the tracks. Before Diesel could speak, a low growling sound drifted through the air. "That's new," Diesel said. "Indeed, Diesel," agreed the Fat Controller. Diesel looked up to see an unfamiliar blue engine approaching the yard. "Diesel, this is D7101. He will be helping with the Kirk-Ronan branch reconstruction until James has been repaired." "Pleased to meet you," 7101 said. "I'm pleased to meet you too," Diesel replied. D7101 glanced over at the Fat Controller. "Sir, may I ask something?" "Of course. My controller mentioned you requested me specifically, and I was just wondering why." The Fat Controller smiled. "You helped one of my engines once. Oliver wanted to return the favour." "I see," 7101 replied, even though he didn't. He glanced over at the train of sleepers and rails. "Is that for me?" he asked. "I believe so," Diesel said. "Then I had better get to work." With a cheerful toot of his horn, 7101 moved off to turn around. A short while later, 7101 was approaching Tidmouth, where he was due to pick up some more trucks. He was still a bit confused. He couldn't really remember meeting anyone named Oliver. But as he pulled into the yard at Tidmouth, he spotted a tank engine standing at the water tower, and everything became clear. "It's Oliver, isn't it?" he said as he came alongside. "Glad to see you made it after all." A grin crossed the little Western engine's face as he recognized the diesel. It was a narrow escape, even with your help. I'm glad to see you made it here too. I thought you might have been scrapped. The high mech's face fell. Most of my brothers have been. I was lucky. They put me into maintenance service. Thank you for asking Sir Topham to bring me here. Well, you know what they say. One good deed deserves another. Both engines chuckled. A moment later, Oliver's driver leant out of his cab. Come on, Oliver. It's time for our next train. I'm afraid I must get going, Oliver said, and with that he chuffed off. As he left, Oliver didn't see a sad frown cross D7101's face. What the diesel hadn't mentioned was that after James was repaired, he would be sent back to the other railway. Given that his brothers had been withdrawn, he didn't know what would happen to him after that.